We're talking with John Ellsworth today, and we are going to speak about his latest column called Reinventing Your Future. John Ellsworth with Success Strategies. Tell us a little bit about where did you get that headline and what are you talking about?
Well, good morning, Joel. I thought that when I first came across the name Coco Chanel, and I wasn't doing a perfume commercial, but I thought it was kind of interesting. I was reading an article about her way of thinking, and I thought, gee, isn't that something we need to at least, not necessarily adapt, but at least consider in the dairy industry? Because one of the big things that she pushes for in her thinking is basically, if there's something in my business that I don't like, and I'm sure we can find things in the dairy business we don't like the last 5 years, but she basically says, if there's something I don't like, I tried to find its opposite, whatever that was, and utilize or implement that. And I thought, that's kind of thinking out of the box. And I was impressed with the thinking, with her thinking rather, not mine. So I admired her thinking, because I think anybody that takes a look at things they don't like, and I thought about things like, the simplest one is low milk prices. Lord knows we've had low milk prices, not so much this year, but the prior 4 years, they were horrid ever since the end of 2014. And I thought a good example is, okay, we don't like the low milk prices. So obviously the opposite of that would be high milk prices. But then the question is, how do you get to them? And I think the answer is that you don't wait for the low milk prices to arrive. Ahead of that, when prices are high, you start looking at things like, there's some great margin protection program, the dairy margin coverage, the dairy revenue protection program. And I think if that just gets us thinking out of the box a little bit in that respect, I think that's a very positive thing for our industry.
And you mentioned that in the article. You also talked about, about feed prices. Obviously, nobody likes high feed prices, and we can only be hopeful that the Midwest weather this year won't have too big an impact on that. But you mentioned feed prices too. Talk about that.
Well, I think that's another good example. And not just this year, but any year, dairymen really need to be thinking about contracts. Using call options with a broker is another example. And part of the margin protection program will help offset some of that from the revenue perspective. But I think it's a little comical, but whether you're talking about revenue protection or cost protection, when things are going really hunky-dory, like they were in 2014, and we're getting $22 for milk, people are saying, gee, why would I want to put options in place or contracts now? Well, the reality is that's the time we need to be thinking about it, because there's only one thing we know with almost certainty, and that is that those high milk prices won't stay, or those low feed prices won't stay. So with that in mind, we need to do some contracting on the revenue or the feed cost side. And I think that it's not about hitting home runs. Singles win games too. And I can assure you, as I will all producers, we're never going to hit every one of them correct. But there's this thing, I like to call it tiered layers of, if you're concerned about corn prices, for example, and I'm not saying you should be, but if we were this year, then start laying in some tiers of contracts throughout 2019 and throughout 2020. And we don't have to hit all of them right, but the blended average of those tiers will keep us most likely keep us in a more profitable mode.
I found one of your analogies about parachutes kind of interesting when we think about our businesses. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but just mention that.
No, that's fine. I think, parachutes, and I forget what the analogy was. The parachutes, our mind is just like a parachute. It only works if it's open.
There you go.
And I think if you look around, I'm not critiquing the industry because I don't think of everything either. But one of the things I've enjoyed the last 20 plus years in consulting work that I've done at Success Strategies is that there is always an answer to every question. I may not have it, you may not have it, but it's being open to suggestions and brainstorming. And you and I and some other colleagues are going to do that in a couple of weeks at a session we have planned. But I think it's thinking about different ways to do things. I don't have to be the only one to come up with a solution, and none of us does. But I think if we put our heads together, we can find other ways to do some things. And I would challenge the industry to take a look at some of those things, whether it's milk pricing or whatever quantity control of milk production. I just think there's nobody that can continue to go on like we had the prior 4 years from 2015 through 2018. All we're really doing is squeezing people out of the business. And so there has to be a happy medium where we approach that, I think.
Yeah, you finished that article up with a good question, which is, what will you do differently going forward?
Yeah, I think it's a good question we all should be asking. And ultimately, that same question goes back to the Coco Chanel original question, which is, if you don't like the way things are turning out, what are you going to do differently? And that's part of being a responsible adult. And I don't want to sound like some kind of counselor here, but reality is, if I don't like the way things are going in my business, then I need to figure out something different. In the case of a dairyman, there are a number of possibilities. Do we utilize programs like the Dairy Revenue Protection, some of these new programs that have come out, or do we start doing some different things? Do I introduce a product of my own? That's not a crime. I think that's still good. And being an entrepreneur that I am, I'm all for it. I think it's exciting to see people develop new things. But I think ultimately the question is, if I don't like the way things are turning out, what do I need to do differently? And it may be that someone else comes up with the answer for you, but you won't see it as an entrepreneur or as a dairyman. You won't see it if you're not looking for it. And I think that's the key to it. Ultimately, we need to be looking for those new ideas and recognize them and take advantage of them when they do come through.
Well, I think that's good for any of us in business and maybe even in life. So, John, thank you very much for speaking with us today. We're talking with John Ellsworth of Success Strategies. And this is Joel Hastings for DairyBusiness.com.